So Everything isn't really a narrative game, but it does take you on a sort of journey. And while I don't know if what I talk about here can constitute true spoilers, if you really want to go in blind, I do cover most of what the game's trying to do. That said, it's such an abstract game that I don't know if many of you would mind all that much, so mostly I'm just stating this as a courtesy, but encouraging you to watch even if you haven't played it because more people need to play this game. That said, let's get started.
I find it a little difficult to say what the subject matter of this seminar is going to be, because it's too fundamental to give it a title. I'm going to talk about what there is. Now, the first thing, though, that we have to do is to get our perspectives with some background.
I've often complained on this show about the trouble with adapting things into video games. The easiest thing to do is just take a property and instead of systemizing it and finding ways to recreate or represent it through gameplay and systems, just slap it into the hot genre of the moment, whether it's 2D platformers, third-person shooters, or clicky time-waster games. It's the difference between Alien Isolation, a game that tries to recapture specific concepts and tones from the original film through gameplay, and Alien 3 on the SNES, a game about shooting hundreds of aliens based on a movie with one alien and no guns. So it's always nice to see an attempt to adapt something from one medium to another that really tries to systemize its source material. But it's even more interesting when the thing being adapted isn't a traditional narrative, but something more abstract. SimCity, for example, was at least in part the result of Will Wright adapting J. Wright Forrester's models of urban planning, but that was a description of a model being turned into a functional game system. Everything, on the other hand, is an attempt to translate nothing less than the core tenets of an entire philosophical outlook, that of one Alan Watts. For the uninitiated, Watts was a British philosopher best known at this point for his collection of languid, almost meandering, but always captivatingly told speeches and lectures that discuss various heady theological and philosophical concepts in a folksy, down-to-earth way.
You, as a human being, you grow out of this physical universe in just exactly the same way that an apple grows off an apple tree. So let's say the tree which grows apples is a tree which apples, using apple as a verb. And a world in which human beings arrive is a world that peoples. And so the existence of people is symptomatic of the kind of universe we live in.
A lot of his thinking was influenced by Buddhist, Zen, and Taoist philosophies that he attempted to translate in a way that would be palatable to Western audiences. His speeches covered everything from the difficulties with letting go of the ego to finding the interconnectivity and divine in all things to issues of identity and self. Everything takes snippets from a variety of speeches on all of those topics and attempts to make a game that reflects the philosophical ideas being discussed, and the results are interesting.
We have this hostility to the external world because of the superstition, the myth, the absolutely unfounded theory that you yourself exist only inside your skin. Now, I want to propose another idea altogether. Billions of years ago, you were a big bang. Now you're a complicated human being.
If I had to describe everything using only other video games, I would say that it's sort of a mix of Spore's Power of 10 scale thing, Katamari Damacy's low-poly renderings of thousands of objects of various categories that the game sort of passively suggests you could collect, Nobi Nobi Boy's small, absurdist game spaces with minimal interactions, and Mountain, an impenetrable game about literally being a mountain that seems to dare its players to ask if it's even a game. That last game seems particularly apt, as both it and everything are from the mind of David O'Reilly, who you might know more as the director of a few animated shorts like The External World, or that one episode of Adventure Time.
Hold on, I'm almost done. So we were trapped inside this huge egg, and after a while you started dancing in this kind of sign language.
But where O'Reilly's Mountain was obstinately opaque, I feel like everything is far more approachable. Weird, perhaps, but more approachable. In everything, you play as, well, everything. There are a variety of objects at 6 different size and time scales, ranging from microscopic to cosmic, each brimming with stuff. And befitting Watts' belief that your ego deceives you with a sense of individualism when you are truly one facet of an interconnected universe finding itself again and again, you can be pretty much everything in everything. You can be ladybugs and continents and oil rigs and cars and individual molecules and even the mathematical constructs that define the rules of existence itself. But the game also doesn't want to give you the impression that you're a single consciousness possessing each object like you're a ghost hopping from host to host, because that preserves the concept of you-ness that the game wants you to abandon. So you can grab multiple copies of the same object, and in time, objects from the same group, and eventually, everything. You are not a polar bear, you are a set of polar bears, and also the ground they walk on, and the star they orbit, and the fish they eat. This, above everything else, is the core conceit of the game. That you are not you, that you are everything, and everything is you. That boundaries between things are simply an illusion concocted primarily by the ego to preserve itself. And as a ludic metaphor for the loss of ego, I think it works pretty well. There really is no singular entity, timescale, or magnification to anchor your viewpoint. Everything is relative. You may spend 10 seconds as a leaf fluttering around on the ground, and 4 million years as a collection of planets drifting through the cosmos, all in a span of about 90 seconds of gameplay. And while Watts has spoken about a wide variety of concepts, including in this very game, it really is the loss of ego the game spends the most time trying to develop and realize through game systems, because it also gets a second set of systems that kind of drive the overall structure of the game, tutorial, whatever you want to call it. Regardless, the beginning of everything opens up next to several golden structures that you can't transfer into. They're odd and stand out against the otherwise natural environment, but you forget about them pretty quickly as you play the game and get bigger and smaller and move all throughout the cosmos. And it turns out that while exploring the game world, you can collect the thoughts of other objects. These are usually snarky little blurbs about the object's personal issues or viewpoints on being whatever it is they are. As you collect them, you're slowly able to express your own thoughts by basically performing a Markov chain generator on the thoughts you've already collected. The more thoughts in your library, the more coherent and the more varied your own thoughts will be. It's cute and provides some light absurdist humor as you explore the universe. But it also lays the groundwork for a metaphor about conscious thought blocking greater truths. But we'll come back to that in a second. Early on in the game, while you're still near the Golden Gates, one of the first thoughts you overhear is a warning to remember where you are so that you could always find your way back home if needed. This turns out to be prescient advice. At some point, a few hours into the game, everything suggests that those Golden Gates are now open to be descended into, and can only be found on your original starting location. If and when you finally find your way back and descend into one of them, you find yourself in a warped nightmarescape combining various objects of all different sizes and scales and time periods. TVs, teapots, and trumpets float in a sea of other objects that have their meshes ruined and polygons missing. Worse, it turns out that you can't leave. You are now trapped here and cannot ascend back to your starting location. And as you float through this broken version of the world that you once knew, you notice something. All of the thoughts you now see aren't so much the snarky idle thoughts you'd find above, they're sorrowful and sad. Like you, everything else is trapped here, and they're all trapped here by these crushing personal issues. People they treated poorly, years they wasted doing whatever it was that wasn't what they wanted, sisters they never got to say goodbye to until it was too late. The implication is that everything in the Golden Gate is trapped here by these thoughts. In time, and with enough exploration, you find that the answer is to clear your memory of all stored thoughts, both yours and those of others. By consciously making an effort to clear your mind, you are suddenly able to see the relativity of all things and return to the surface, where there is no you and personal issues don't exist. It's a blunt metaphor for meditation and looking past one's conscious self, freeing your mind by wiping away the thoughts that constrain you, expanding your awareness of the connectivity of everything by destroying the thoughts that convince you that you're separate from everything. The entire Golden Gate sequence is a metaphor for being tricked by your ego into believing your troubles define you. They're also the one area, near as I can tell, that don't spawn Watts' dialogue. This is an area free of his philosophy, and in so being is a nightmarescape of entities trapped in a solipsistic nightmare where they see only themselves. All of this lacks the elegance of the game's scaling and bodiless core play, but it does a decent enough job of selling its position on Watts' philosophy. That's not to say the game captures all of Watts' views perfectly. One thing the game doesn't do so well is selling the true interconnectivity of all things. Admittedly, this is sort of hard to do without systemizing everything, but it does hurt the game's ability to sell Watts' philosophy a bit. The idea isn't just that everything exists in the universe and is therefore part of the universe, but that the processes and the doing are themselves part of the universe.
The whirlpool is something the stream is doing. And exactly the same way, the whole universe is doing each one of us. And I see you today, and I recognize you tomorrow, just as I would recognize a whirlpool in a stream. But you're moving. The whole world is moving through you. All the cosmic rays, all the food you're eating, the stream of steaks and milk and eggs and everything is just flowing right through you. When you're wiggling the same way, the world is wiggling, the stream is wiggling you. But the problem is, you see, we haven't been taught to feel that way.
It's not that bears exist and in so doing are part of this grand experience called the universe. They eat fish and in so doing help define the fish. They live in the woods and help define what we consider the woods to be. Per Watts, individuality is an illusion because we're all interconnected by actions, defined by systems that only exist in relation to one another. I am defined as much by not being you as I am by being me. It's not that there are lots of things in the universe and that's what makes a universe, it's that there are lots of things in the universe doing what they do and that's what makes the universe work. Everything in the game has bears and fish and forests, but I don't know if the game successfully sells the idea that they are all defined by one another, so much as it sells the idea that they're all just here. They don't interact. Often enough, they're not even really seen next to each other. And again, that's a huge ask for a game that is already tremendous in scope for such a small budget, but if we're assessing its ability to translate a philosophy into mechanics, I think that's kind of a big one. Especially because the snippets included in the game bring this concept up, that the thing is a false illusion of continuity, that instead it's the doing that matters. And in-game there isn't much to present the doing, just the thing. Watts compares the illusion of continuity of a person to a flame or whirlpool, suggesting that it isn't a material thing that has continuity, but a pattern of behavior. The game tries to sort of loosely hand-wave at this by including a dancing mechanic, which at first seems like a metaphor for sex, since any two objects like one another can dance and in so doing produce another one of themselves. But eventually you can amass groups of wholly disparate objects, and the dancing takes on a more abstract view. And it seems like that's a metaphor for the interactions the game otherwise ignores, but it does ignore them. And this is nitpicking, but the game does suffer from some awkward tone problems. Not to a critical degree, but like, Mountain had a snarky and absurdist sense of humor also, but at least in Mountain, when an electric fan smashed into your mountain, or the mountain seemed to share its thoughts with you, it was basically just as inscrutable and inexplicable as anything else in the game. Everything, on the other hand, tends towards weighty issues of the mind, soul, and the nature of the universe, so the fact that the game is kind of snarky and occasionally tips over into outright fourth-wall-breaking absurdism. It feels weird and dissonant with the rest of the game. I get the need to provide some levity against these weighty subjects, but Watts' own charm does a decent job of that all on its own, and it's not like watching scores of animals rotate in 90-degree increments to move across the lands while you have a conversation with a house isn't absurdly humorous enough to begin with. Still, it's hard to be too critical of a game with this grand of scope done on this small of a scale. There are so many great little ideas here that sell the loss of oneness, like how if left alone the game will begin to play itself. You, the player, are not required because you are just one facet of everything, and if everything is still running, it doesn't really need you, so it'll just continue on in your absence. It's the closest the game comes to dealing with Watts' talks on death, but I think it's a pretty effective way to broach the subject. Just the fact that we have a game that exists solely to catalog a philosopher's worldview is a pretty cool achievement. It's definitely not a game for everyone. The whole thing is about exploring Watts' philosophy through play, and you're either going to catch that particular drift or it will completely pass you by. And if it doesn't work for you, then you either need to really dig exploration or collection to get into the game mechanically. But for those looking for a ludic metaphor of abandoning the self and finding the true oneness of all things, well, you don't really have a lot of options, but this is still a good one.
The myths underlying our culture and underlying our common sense have not taught us to feel identical with the universe, but only parts of it, only in it, only confronting it, aliens. And we are, I think, quite urgently in need of coming to feel that we are the eternal universe, each one of us. Otherwise, we're going to go out of our heads.
One of the things I love in this game is how time scales with your size. Watching raindrops slowly fall and sploosh on the ground when you're small, watching the seasons change as a continent, and watching continents themselves rise and fall as a planet is fascinating. Also, I recognize that I probably could have engaged more with Watts' philosophy itself, weighing his folksy wisdom critically against other belief structures. But as a game critic who isn't particularly well trained in either theology or philosophy, I figured I'd focus on how well the game handled the ideas, and let those that know better than me deal with the ideas themselves. And as far as that goes, I really did enjoy this game. Certainly better than Mountain.